Now we have the opportunity to hear Reverend Miofsky of the Gathering in St. Louis, one of the fastest growing churches in United Methodism. Matt, I don't know if I got your name pronounced exactly right. If not, my apologies. We're looking forward to hearing your vision of the new United Methodist movement and knowing more about your ministry in Missouri.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Kelly, for that song. It was beautiful. There's so many bishops who've spoken so far. I feel really honored. So thanks to all the bishops who spoke before me and the ones who will speak after. And thanks, Don, for having me here. It's great to be with you all. My name is Matt Miofsky. You got the name right. I'm pastor of the Gathering in St. Louis. It's a church that I started 16 years ago. So I'm starting my 17th year in that ministry, and I'm grateful for the opportunity and for what's happened in that church, and for now to get to be here with you. And I really thank you for all those who spoke before me. I hope that what I offer really is just building on what's come before, especially Bishop Bickerton, talking about that pivot. How do we pivot now towards a new kind of United Methodism? And so I just want to share a little bit here about how I envision a new United Methodist movement. And in the way of getting into this, I just want to tell a quick story. I serve on the board of trustees for a United Church of Christ seminary here in St. Louis called Eden. And it's self-proclaimed. It's a progressive seminary. One of its ambitions is to resource the progressive church, and but like a lot of seminaries, it's experiencing, a struggle in admission, new students coming to the seminary. And so it's something the board has to tackle quite often. And we were sitting in a meeting, and I just had a question. It's a question, and it's an honest question, one that's been sort of plaguing me for a long time. And I asked it there. I said, if we as a seminary are more inclusive than most, if we as a seminary welcome even more people that so many churches or seminaries before wouldn't have ever thought of welcoming into leadership in the church, if we're a seminary that has been committed, and I think committed well, to breaking down barriers, then why do we have less people, not more? And I didn't ask that question to be provocative or to play devil's advocate. I ask it as an honest question, and it's one that I think could be said for the church as well. It's something I ask all the time. As our churches in many places, in United Methodism, have become more welcoming of people that traditionally were turned away. If we've worked hard to remove barriers that have kept people out, if we've put on our website or even on our signs a proclamation that all people are welcome, then a question I think that we ought to wrestle with is why in so many of those places do we have less people, not more? And it's one that I would say is at the heart of the work that I do here in St. Louis. We've been described as a progressive evangelical church, and it's a label that, while I didn't put it on us, I freely accept it, actually. And it's given us the opportunity to really think about, what is the primary work that we have to do? And I'll say, just sort of honestly up front, I don't think it's enough for us to, remove barriers or prohibitions. It's not far enough for us to sort of generically welcome people. I don't think it's enough for United Methodism to have the right opinions on a range of social issues. I really do think that we're at a point where we must envision a movement that is actually effective again at reaching new people with the good news of Christ, and especially reaching the people that we now say we want to reach, that we now say are welcome, or people that we've traditionally turned away. And so, when I envision a new United Methodist movement, what I envision is a movement that once again prioritizes and puts at the very center, an effectiveness in reaching new people with the good news of Jesus. And so what I want to talk about just briefly with my time, and then I'd love to answer questions too. If you all have questions, drop them in the chat, or in the Q&A, and I'm going to try to pop over at the end and at least address a few of those if I can. But I just want to talk about what I think are 5 features of a new United Methodist movement, what 5 features of that movement would be. And what I think really we need to focus on as a denomination moving forward, hopefully on the other side of a church that's more inclusive. You know, the first feature is I think a recovery of evangelism. And I really appreciated Bishop Trimble sort of saying evangelism doesn't have to be a bad word. Evangelism doesn't have to be something that we run away from. But evangelism is and should remain at the heart of who we are as United Methodists. You know, the past several years, and I think Don said this in the intro, you know, the Gathering was named as one of the top 3 fastest growing United Methodist churches in the country. I don't say that as a brag or anything like that, but I get asked about it a lot. And one person just sort of asked me really bluntly, you know, how does a progressive church make the top 3? Because the narrative we hear so often is that, you know, the evangelical conservative churches are the ones that grow. With many of the churches that might leave the denomination, it's the ones that are growing that are going to be leaving, and what's going to be left is a progressive church that dies. I mean, that narrative is out there. If you're not getting it, God bless you. I get it weekly in my email through some newsletter or somebody saying that. And so the question was, you know, how is it that a progressive church is actually growing, is in the top 3? And my answer, I mean, there's a lot of answers to that. But one of the answers that I've landed on, that I've spoken about a lot, is I think from the very beginning of the Gathering, we were willing to look at everything about the church from the ground up and focus it on reaching new people. Or to put it a different way, we were unapologetically focused on new people. And we were willing to change or to pivot everything towards this end. You know, I think we as United Methodists have to remember that Methodism started and grew as a movement to engage those who were traditionally not in churches. You know, it was a revivalist movement. And I think we need to recover a sense of that being our primary mission. You know, I often describe evangelism as sort of a muscle that a long time ago sort of atrophied in United Methodism. It's a little bit like, you know, we're a patient that's getting the cast cut off, and that evangelism muscle it hasn't been exercised in a long time. I joke around that the Methodist church I grew up in, you know, our evangelism strategy was pretty simple. You know, if new Methodists moved to the small town that I grew up in, hopefully they'll come to the Methodist church. And that was our strategy for reaching new people. It's been a long time, I think, since many of our churches have really thought about what it means to be proactive in not having an evangelism committee, but putting at the heart of everything that we do. You know, how is this inviting new people to follow Jesus? And I say this because we are working against really strong forces right now. I mean, think about it. We're trying to now reach a group of people that in some cases for generations have been told that they don't belong. You know, the people that we want to reach here at the Gathering are not neutral on church. They aren't simply bored or have written it off or, you know, just seen it as sort of irrelevant. They've actually actively been told they don't belong here. They have been actively kept out. And when they've actually tried to participate or offer leadership, they've been kicked out. And so I say that we have huge work to do. I mean, I appreciate all the people that have hung in with United Methodists, but we have to remember that there are hundreds of thousands, millions more marginalized people who are not just waiting around to get into the church. You know, they've written the church off a long time ago. And so evangelism needs our attention and work. And I'll just say that I think it needs work from the progressive Christian community. We need to work on a biblical recovery of evangelism, theological reflection on what evangelism is. I think it's important that we hear and offer up critiques and new understandings of that word in light of new voices. And then, you know, just really bluntly, we need to get better at actually doing it, at practicing it. So, you know, put really simply, I think the new United Methodist movement has to be unapologetically and radically focused on the invitation of new people to find life in Christ. And we can't shy away from that word. And we can't have it as just sort of a subset of things that we do, but I think it has to be at the heart of how we understand ourselves. And so, I hope that the new Methodist movement is one that recovers that word evangelism. A second feature, I think, is a refocusing on the gospel. And I've really been appreciative that several of the speakers that come before me have talked about this. As we struggle for the full inclusion of all people, we have to refocus ourselves on what the good news is that we're actually offering them. Or to put it differently, what's at stake? What do we believe is at stake when people are far away from Christ? What is the power of a relationship with Christ? Why do they need it? What's at stake for people? And I think this is important because perhaps a long time ago for some of us, the simple message of, hey, if you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to go to hell, or if you don't believe in Jesus, there's some kind of punishment, or, to the extent that people maybe don't quite believe that anymore, we have to come up with new answers about why the sharing of Christ is important. I think this is something we've actually, struggled with, that we haven't always been good at why evangelism matters, on what is exactly the good news that we're offering people and what's at stake in their lives if they have it or if they don't. And the reason I think this is an important question is I think it gets kind of to the heart of why the United Methodist Church exists. Why do we think it's important that God has raised up the people called Methodists? Why would it matter for a person to walk through the door of your church? And so I think refocusing on the gospel necessarily entails a new vision for discipleship. What does discipleship in Jesus look like? What's at stake when people, again, don't know Christ? And so I think we have to get good again at articulating that message. I was at jurisdictional conference here in the South Central jurisdiction and got to interview all these new bishops. And our first question to every bishop candidate when we were interviewing was just, hey, what's the good news of Jesus? Can you tell it to us in 2 or 3 sentences? And I'm not going to call out any people, but it was amazing how many candidates' eyes got wide and sort of froze up for a second, frantically searching, knowing that this should be easy for us. It should roll off the tongue, but that it's not always easy for us to say what is that good news in a simple and a compelling way. And so I think we need, as a United Methodist movement, to refocus on the gospel. What exactly is the good news in the lives of people that we're trying to reach? Third feature of the New Methodist movement, I hope, is a reinvestment in church planting. I know I'm biased. I started a church, as I said, in 2006. It was a time when, there was no real denomination-wide church planting resources. Our conference didn't really have any resources for church planting. There was no staff. And yet I felt compelled and called to start a new congregation, not really in a fast-growing suburb, but actually right in the heart of the city. We're right in St. Louis. I often say St. Louis has lost population every year since the late 50s. We've lost half of our population in 2 generations, and St. Louis City and St. Louis County, neither of them are growing. And yet we decided we wanted to start a church right there in the city, and that's exactly what we did. And so I know I'm biased, but I really think that one of the features of a new United Methodist movement has to be a huge reinvestment in church planting. I often joke, congregation I went and spoke with once is, we want to grow our Sunday school program. What do you think is the best way to grow a Sunday school program? I told them, start a new Sunday school class. If churches ask me, what's the best way to grow our small group ministry? I say, start new small groups. And I think the same is true for us. What's the best way to reach new people? It's to start new kinds of churches. I'm really thrilled that right after me, we've got some, beautiful examples of new churches and the ways that they're reaching new communities. And so I don't want to spoil that, but it's coming next. But I think this is so critically important. I mean, I heard the news today, and then Bishop Bickerton referred to it, that, that today North Carolina has a special called session of their annual conference, I think there's 240 plus churches leaving. As Bishop Bickerton said, something like 33% of United Methodist churches. There's other conferences, some of which are indeed meeting today as well. And I look at this, of course, with great sadness, like many of you do. My heart breaks in some ways for this, but I can't help but the church planter in me to say, but there's also this incredible opportunity. We're going to have communities all over the United States, especially, in places like where I live, that do not have a congregation that is United Methodist. In many of the towns, like the one that I grew up in, we will not have a church that just allows certain people to walk in the doors and exist in the pews, much less lead or be married or work with kids. We have a huge opportunity to plant churches in all sorts of communities. And I really think we need a strategy for planting in areas where there's a large percentage of churches that are leaving. I think we need to be, once again, an urban church planting movement where we're planting in the midst of communities that long ago have been sort of abandoned. That's our story here in St. Louis. I think we need to be thinking about rural and small town church planting, especially in communities, like I said, which may not have any other church that presents a vision of the gospel that's similar to the United Methodist Church. I think we need creative kinds of churches that are led by different kinds of leaders than those that we've traditionally lifted up. I always like to say, if we want to reach different people, we need to allow different people into leadership of those communities. And we need to see that. I think we're going to have some examples of that in the talk that follows mine. But I just think, again, church planting can't be a side item. It can't be the kind of thing that we fund 1, 2, maybe every 2 or 3 years, but it has to become kind of a radical part of how we see our work. I think a new United Methodist movement is going to have to once again become a church planting movement. A fourth feature of a new United Methodist movement is a redefining of pastoral ministry. I don't know if this makes me a nerd, but I love, one of my favorite books is, it's now a few years old, but the Francis Asbury biography entitled American Saint. It was written by a professor at Mizzou, so Missouri boy, John Wigger. And he talks about how Asbury understood the work of circuit riders and pastors that he trained and sent out. And if you read that book, you would see that, one of Asbury's big concerns is that when he sent pastors out or circuit riders out, that they would spend too much time with the Methodists that were already there in the places that he sent them. And you can see him actually writing about this, that, try to minimize your time with the groups or the bands that are there. He reminded pastors that they were sent to serve the community, not the Methodists in the community. And I thought that was such a brilliant reminder. It's simple, but he wanted them to go to the communities. He appointed them to communities, not to congregations or not to particular groups. And in fact, he warned pastors that the existing groups could often monopolize and suck up their time. They had to be careful of that. The role of pastor was more for a community than it was for the existing Methodists in an area. And Bishop Bickerton, I think, talked about this, that one of the fears was that circuit riders would become educated, settled pastors, that frontier ministry would turn into building and staying in a particular place, that the movement would become too institutionalized and supported by a structure. And so I think one of the geniuses of keeping people there for short periods of time was not allowing them to get too tethered to the Methodists who already existed, but rather keep them focused on the idea that their work is for communities. And of course, we've seen pastoral ministry change significantly over time. And I think it's important that we recognize at least that part of what supported this focus on evangelism, part of what supported the church planting movement in early Methodism is that pastors saw themselves as pastors to communities, not just to the people who are already in the quote unquote church. And I really think in the new United Methodist movement, we also have so much work to do when it comes to defining or redefining what we mean by the role of pastor, and therefore kind of redefine how we train those who are called to ministry. And I don't mean that every pastor has to be a church planter or every pastor has to be an entrepreneur, but I do think it means that we have to speak about values of creativity and passion for new people and a willingness to rethink how we do church, leadership development, vision, execution, financial stewardship of a movement. We have to think about not only how we do the work, but who we call to do it. We're already seeing that the kinds of people offering themselves up for ministry don't follow the typical track that that we're so used to. And I think that's a good thing. We're going to have to redefine pastoral ministry to include non-traditional leadership as the norm, not the exception. And I think this is maybe a hard truth to share. We can no longer be content with sort of defining pastoral ministry as primarily taking care of a church, but we really need pastors to perhaps even minimize the amount of time they spend with the people who are already there and try to maximize the amount of time that they spend with and for the people who aren't. And so I think a new Methodist movement just has to sort of redefine and rethink what it means to be a pastor. And then just the last feature, the fifth feature of envisioning a new United Methodist movement, I think has to be removing institutional and bureaucratic barriers to growth. I kind of said this at the beginning, but the prohibitions against LGBTQ people are not the only thing that needs to be dropped from the discipline. If we're going to start there, we shouldn't finish there. We just need to keep going. There's a lot about that book that we probably need to rethink. And we need a simpler, more streamlined, and more focused institution that supports instead of inhibits creativity and growth. And the bishops could probably speak more to this than me, but I think this means it's certainly not limited to this, but we have to rethink how money is spent at every level, conferences on up. I think we have to shift away. In many of our places, we still incentivize buildings and raising money for capital. And we have to start incentivizing instead money that's raised and spent on new ministry. I think we just have to get rid of the territorialism that still exists in most places. We still bump up against it all the time as a multi-site church that is trying to start new sites. I mean, I think on the local level, it means a reduction of committees, streamlining of leadership. But we need to build new structures that support and don't inhibit the work of growth and reaching new people. There's, as one of my former bishops said, there's so many places in United Methodism where people can say no to a new idea. And we need to, I think, much more become a permission giving and instead of a intensely rule following organization, especially when it comes to the starting of new communities. So friends, I think that, to kind of end where I started, I think the new United Methodist movement has to be one that's not only working to remove prohibitions or generally welcome people, but has to then take that a step further, that one that recovers a passion for the proactive work of sharing good news with people who have long since given up on church. And here's the good news, I think, and here's where I get excited to stay United Methodist, is I think we're well equipped to be that movement. I look around and I see pastors who are coming in behind me, younger pastors, more diverse, more creative, more passionate about the work of reaching new people. I love that. I look around and we have resources, money in our conferences that we could put towards this work. We have leaders, not just bishops, but district superintendents. We have now conference staff. Virtually every conference I talk to now has a person or staff thinking about this kind of work. And I think we have opportunities plenty, and we have to remember that with the pain that comes with so many churches disaffiliating in many places also comes a tremendous opportunity for us to start churches that really are different and that reach different kinds of people. And so ultimately, I look on this as an opportunity, that as we go through this wilderness moment, as we go through this transformation period in our denomination, we have a tremendous opportunity to look at our movement from top to bottom and to reinvent it so that it's unapologetically focused on this task of reaching new people. And so with that, I think I'll stop, and I think I'm maybe the first one to do this, but if there's questions or things that have popped up in the Q&A, I'm happy to answer some of those, and then I'll yield my time back to you, Don.
Could you tell us about the gathering?
Sure. Yeah, the gathering started, as I said, in St. Louis City. We started in 2006, and we started in actually a closed down United Methodist Church building in the city of St. Louis. I didn't share this, but I spoke briefly about how St. Louis has declined in population every year since 1960, and as a result, we've closed virtually every church in the city limits of St. Louis. Not quite all of them, and so we started the gathering in the city, wanting to sort of reverse that trend. Today we're a multi-site church. We have 3 sites around St. Louis. All 3 of them started in old closed down church buildings, 2 of those United Methodist Church buildings. We have a 4th and a 5th site in process here. And so we're excited to see that happen. Every one of our sites has a site pastor who provides local leadership, and then I'm responsible for the church as a whole. And so that's just a little bit about the gathering. But one of the things that I do think is hopeful is I know that sometimes I'm asked to speak, and sometimes large churches or fast-growing churches can be a source of hope, but for a lot of pastors, also a source of frustration, because you can see things that aren't possible or you don't feel like are possible in your place. And one of the things I always like to highlight is, as much as the gathering has grown, we've done it in each and every one of our sites is in a place where the population is in decline. It's not in a place where the population is rapidly, growing. But I think it's just a testament to how many people have been just kind of walked away from church, and how many people who are around us, even in a city that is in decline population wise, there's a church that's growing, and one that's growing with a unapologetically, progressive theology. And so I think that's hopeful about what's possible in places all over the country. And what I want to see is progressive churches no longer sort of buying into or living into that narrative that only conservative evangelical churches grow. So, we might have the message right, we might have the gospel right, we might include more people, but that's necessarily going to mean that maybe we're smaller or that we don't grow as fast. And I want that. I think that's a myth that I'm very passionate about seeing changed in the new United Methodism.
I think we have time for one more question. One came on chat, and I'm going to read it to you.
Great.
Somebody writes, I recently spoke with Bishop Trimble on his podcast about Metaverse Church. I believe this is a major opportunity for church planting and an overall Methodist presence or movement in the digital space. We'd love to hear your thoughts about metaverse digital churches and how the United Methodist Church can move into the digital mission field.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for asking it. So, yeah, actually, here at the gathering last year, we started a new 2-year generosity initiative to sort of talk about financial giving, and we're not building a new building, but built into that was this idea of building online and meta church. And so we talked with people about the fact that a lot of their money this time around isn't going to go towards, actual brick and mortar, but virtual brick and mortar. And so this is something right now that we're beginning to experiment with here at the Gathering, is church in the metaverse. So I'm not an expert on it. One thing we've been able to do is hire a couple people that know a lot more about this than I do. What I do know is that there are people that increasingly are maybe never going to walk in the doors of a physical church, but this is where they are more comfortable. But even beyond that, I think there's just a lot of people, and we have to realize that our front doors anymore are not our literal physical front doors of our buildings, but instead our front doors are really these digital spaces that even for people who are going to end up in our in-person worship services, they start usually in one of these places, whether it's online church, podcast, even meta church. And so I think that this is sort of a new frontier. I don't know the answers. I don't know a ton about it. Maybe some of the panelists who will come after me will know some things that I don't, but I think it's a place where we as Methodists have to be willing once again to sort of experiment. I think about, what it would mean for us to be sort of digital circuit riders, trying new things in these sort of new areas. And so I hope that the generation of pastors starting new things kind of behind me are people that know more than I do and are finding ways to engage people who not at first or maybe never are going to show up in person. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.